listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast from S&P Global Market Intelligence. In each episode, our experts will provide you with the where, how, and when to make decisions that transform your business.
Hi, I'm Kristen Hallam, Content Strategist at S&P Global Market Intelligence, and your host for this episode of the Economics and Country Risk podcast. The 74-year-old North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as Nato, is holding its summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, on July 11th and 12th. The event will be attended by representatives of the 31 member states, as well as candidate country Sweden. Aspiring NATO members Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine are also likely to send delegates. Joining me from S&P Global Market Intelligence to discuss the summit and its potential outcomes are Lindsay Newman, Head of Geopolitical Thought Leadership, and Alex Kokcharov, Associate Director for Country Risk for Europe and CIS. Thank you both for being here today. Lindsay, can you kick us off by setting the scene for our listeners with the big picture view of NATO today?
Thank you, Kristen. I'm looking forward to our conversation with Alex as well. To contextualize next week's summit, it's useful to look back. And don't worry, I'm not suggesting we go all the way back to World War II or even to the Cold War, but just to the turn of this decade. It was only that long ago, and in some ways, I'm sure we all feel like it was a lifetime, that we were hearing a lot of debate about the future of NATO, conversations around its direction. There was a series of U.S. administrations calling on Europe to contribute its fair share to defense spending and NATO contributions. And there was this famous, perhaps infamous statement by French President Emmanuel Macron that we are currently experiencing the brain death of NATO. So NATO was lumbering along 30 years after the Cold War without a clear rationale, without a clear strategic vision. Was it cyber? They thought maybe yes. Was it space? They also thought maybe yes. Could it still be Russia? And then 24 Feb 2022 came along, and NATO suddenly found itself quite re-energized. At the NATO summit in Madrid just last year, members adopted a new strategic concept organized around three core principles of deterrence and defense, crisis prevention, and cooperative security. And NATO members reaffirmed their commitment to the defense investment pledge, that 2% number of GDP that we frequently hear about. So what's come into view in the last year and a half now since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the conflict there has been a NATO organization for the years ahead. And it's a united NATO relying on a reinvigorated transatlantic relationship, working in tandem with the European Union. And it's also a newly popular NATO with a number of entrants, as you've already mentioned, knocking on the door to join.
Thanks for that overview, Lindsay. And as you noted with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO has a war happening on its doorstep for the first time in over 70 years. And they are meeting in Vilnius, which is close to Russian ally Belarus. Alex, what role has NATO been playing in the conflict, and how has that impacted the trajectory of the war?
Majority of NATO member states have provided support to Ukraine politically, economically, financially, and militarily. The biggest supporters were, of course, the United States, but also the UK and the European Union, some of the countries of which are also part of the NATO, but not all. We've seen a significant increase in cohesion of NATO over the past year, though issues do remain, and there are some countries which are somewhat more problematic in terms of their foreign policy choices and statements. But overall, we've seen a very strong commitment to Ukraine provided by majority of NATO member states. They see that Ukraine is defending itself from an unwarranted aggression, and they have committed to support it with military training and with military supplies so that the Ukrainian armed forces are able to defend their country.
So I'm sure Ukraine is going to be a top agenda item for the summit. What else is on the agenda, Lindsay?
One of the big questions that was overhanging the summit has already been answered, Christian, which is the leadership question. Jens Stoltenberg, who is the Secretary General of NATO, and he's been in that position since 2014, was set to finally step down in the fall, but has agreed to stay on just this week for another year. This is actually the fourth extension of his term. He's widely seen as an effective steward of the partnership, and his remaining is quite obviously connected to the emergent issues on the table. As you said, and as Alex has already raised for us, the leading agenda item is, of course, Ukraine. We got a preview of what to expect on Ukraine at next week's summit last month at the NATO defense minister session. This includes a reported multi-year funding package, commitments to rebuild Ukraine's security and defense sectors, and even what they're calling a NATO-Ukraine Council, which looks to be an organization to bridge the relationship unless and until Ukraine joins as a NATO member. As Alex has said, the support by NATO allies for Ukraine has been quite coherent, and undoubtedly we will see further statements of support at the summit, but the devil will be in the details of those announcements. We could also expect, as we've all already alluded to, a lot of attention on NATO enlargement. We've discussed already Ukraine's potential membership. There's the open question around the timing and process for Sweden to join. The Prime Minister of Sweden is meeting with President Biden this week in the US to discuss that accession process. According to the 2022 strategic concept that was agreed to in Madrid, enlargement is seen by NATO as a historic success and its doors remain open. And the question of NATO's footprint ties into a range of topics that tend to be on NATO summit agenda year on year. And that includes what the organization can do to enhance its deterrence and defense posture, what to do about NATO's eastern flank, how to tackle the shared challenges ahead, and then, of course, the all-important question about how to pay for all of these ambitions. According to NATO's 2022 annual report, which was released this year in March, European allies and Canada increased defensive spending for the 8th year in a row in 2022, and that amounted to $350 billion for defense over those 8-year period. But Kristen, total NATO spending in 2022 alone exceeded $1 trillion. So it's an ongoing math assignment for those NATO members.
Wow, that really sounds like a packed agenda, which I guess is not much of a surprise. But let's see if we can unpack it a little bit, starting with membership. You mentioned Sweden there, which has historically been neutral, and now they've applied for membership following the invasion of Ukraine. Alex, what's the status of that application?
Last year, Sweden submitted its application to join NATO at the same time with Finland, and Finland became officially the newest 31st member of NATO in April this year. Sweden's accession has been delayed due to foreign policy issues, particularly involving Hungary and Turkey. We are still waiting for the ratification of its accession by the parliaments of these two countries. The issue of Turkey has been the most complicated and challenging due to the situation around what Turkey views are Kurdish terrorists, but Sweden views as Turkish activists who are present within Sweden. And it will probably not be immediate, though it appears that by the end of 2023, it's quite likely that Sweden's accession will be also finalized. Once it happens, it will fundamentally make the Baltic Sea into Lake NATO, with the only country outside of the bloc of the Baltic Sea region would be Russia, the country which is in at least political confrontation with NATO right now. So this would mark a very significant enlargement of NATO's territory. But even before that happens, we already see that Swedish armed forces are effectively integrating within the NATO structures such as joint military exercises. And I do not think that the fact that Sweden is not in NATO damages Sweden's ability to defend itself and its military capabilities.
One to watch, as you said, later in the year. Might see some developments there. What about Ukraine? Does Ukraine want to join? And would NATO extend an invitation to them, Alex?
Ukraine would very much like to join. Since 2019, an aspiration to join EU and NATO are parts of Ukrainian constitution. We are quite skeptical that a formal invitation will be offered to Ukraine during this summit. Earlier in June, Secretary General Stoltenberg said that the alliance would not be issuing an invitation as of yet. What Lindsay has mentioned, we think that the political relationship between NATO and Ukraine will be upgraded from the current NATO-Ukraine Commission to a NATO-Ukraine Council, which will be much more aligned with the inner workings of NATO. And it's quite likely that Ukraine will be offered a shorter route to accession when an offer of membership is eventually made at an as yet undetermined future date. With the war still ongoing, kinetic conflict still ongoing in Ukrainian territory, it's unlikely that Ukraine will be offered membership as of now, but it's quite realistic that individual NATO member states would be willing to offer Ukraine post-war security guarantees. And also we're likely to hear about further commitments to provide Ukraine with military assistance amid the ongoing Russian invasion, and as well as increasing efforts on converging Ukrainian armed forces with NATO standards in terms of structure and training and equipment.
And what about the alliance's eastern flank, Alex? What's NATO's approach there?
Yes, we've seen that there have been multiple calls in the past year by the countries on the eastern flank, which now includes Finland, but also all the three Baltic states, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, to increase the NATO presence along the eastern flank. This will likely be one of the topics for discussions in Vilnius, which itself is located very much on the eastern flank, just 30 kilometers away from the border with Belarus, which is a Russian military and political ally. One of the things which I think is going to be changing the conversation around it is the recent mutiny in Russia by Wagner private military company, following which it was announced that a number of Wagner mercenaries are going to be relocating to Belarus and are going to be based at a military facility southeast of Minsk, the Belarusian capital. This clearly raised a lot of concerns in Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, which are NATO states bordering on Belarus. And there have been calls on increased military presence along the eastern flank, including upgrades to the air policing, but also to the numbers of permanently stationed NATO troops on their territory. Poland even went further, even calling for its NATO allies to station nuclear weapons on its territory. So we're likely to hear about these conversations during the summit as well.
And Lindsay, where else is NATO looking these days?
A couple of threads to track, Kristen. First are the shared challenges that I've already alluded to. According to the 2022 strategic concept, the vision for NATO is to be the leading international organization when it comes to the impact of climate change on security. From extreme weather events to climate-driven migration, climate-related risks are likely to present only a more acute security challenge in the year ahead. So how will NATO contribute and lead in this space? There have been talks about investing in the energy transition, leveraging green technologies. Understanding the organization's commitments is one area to watch. Another thread is around partnerships. Again, both the strategic concept and the agenda for the upcoming summit in Vilnius talk about enhancing cooperation with NATO's network of partners in the EU, UN, and Indo-Pacific region. Just a few weeks ago, for instance, the European Council and Stoltenberg held a joint session on EU-NATO cooperation, building on the declaration signed in January of this year, which was intended to deepen the partnership. Strengthening these partnership cuts across security challenges like hybrid conflict, countering terrorism, misinformation campaigns, but also, according to NATO, is about upholding the international rules-based order. And just to say, the focus that NATO has taken up on the Indo-Pacific region over the last few years is particularly noteworthy, drawing the connection between developments in that region and direct impact on Euro-Atlantic security. Finally, I would just suggest we watch developments around nuclear proliferation. We know that Putin has repeatedly put the nuclear threat on the table over the course of the war in Ukraine, in part to diminish Western support. That effort has thus far not succeeded. We also have a Russia that has been non-compliant on the New START treaty and reportedly suspended its participation in the treaty. With nuclear capabilities part of NATO's core value proposition of deterrence and defense, how does the organization intend to respond?
Thanks for that, Lindsay. Alex, since the Cold War ended, defense spending and industrial infrastructure have gotten rusty or anemic, perhaps. What is happening, or what do you expect to happen with respect to defense spending and the defense industry in the near or medium term?
Yes, the end of the Cold War has resulted in a peace dividend, with a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, reducing their defense spending and closing some of their defense manufacturing industry due to no necessity to keep very significant armed forces. The start of large-scale warfare within Europe obviously changed this. It started to actually change starting from 2014, 2015, when we've seen an increase in both defense spending and in the share of defense spending allocated to equipment expenditure. And we've seen that across the board, there has been an increase in both defense spending and the share of it which goes into building equipment and replacing older equipment. The objective, the NATO guideline, is for equipment expenditure to be 20%, and it has been reached by majority of NATO member states, apart from 5 in 2022. It was a significant improvement on 2014 figures, and we've seen that also defense spending has been rising, particularly quickly in the countries on the eastern flank, such as Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which are even setting their own objectives to spend more on defense than the NATO guideline, because they understand the importance of maintaining their military capabilities amid ongoing external risks which originate from Russia. The fact that they border on Russia, they're geographically close to Ukraine, where the war is still ongoing 16 months on, makes them very aware of the risks. And for instance, countries such as Estonia plan to increase their defense spending to 3% of GDP. And that's a very significant increase since where it was in 2014.
Since we've just been talking about industry and companies, this might be a good time to pose the question of why companies should care about NATO. What could it potentially impact their businesses coming out of this summit, for example? Lindsay, do you have thoughts on that? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, it's a great question, Christian. About 10 years ago, NATO established a framework for NATO industry engagement with the goal of encouraging a mutually beneficial relationship between the two. This fall, the NATO Industry Forum will be taking place in Sweden, of all places, with a theme of addressing the new strategic reality together. In a world where business cannot sit on the geopolitical sidelines, in a world where shared challenges are the challenges ahead, we will see opportunities for collaborative shared solutions. We're talking about climate risk, energy transition, technological innovation, cyber, critical infrastructure, food insecurity. They're each areas requiring all hands on deck, and NATO is making it a priority to both invest and partner with the private sector. So this opens up opportunity for private sector actors across the tech, security, defense, and energy sector.
Alex, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think there will be increased cooperation between the defense sector companies and industry and the individual member states and NATO as a whole, partly because of increased cohesion in terms of standards, so that weapons and ammunition can be used across the bloc and are not country specific. So we're going to see increased cooperation in terms of technical standards and to improve interoperability of weapons and ammunition systems, which are manufactured domestically in NATO member states.
Well, thanks both of you for sharing your insights today. Let's wrap up with some signposts for our listeners. Lindsay, what signposts will you be watching for after the summit?
In a way, I would end where we started. Just a few years ago, we found ourselves in this protracted conversation around the future of multilateralism, of which NATO represented example number one, example A. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, and very unfortunately, because of the war in Ukraine, we could have perhaps done a bit less hand-wringing about NATO's continuing relevance. But the question still remains, how will NATO pivot beyond the European security theater to deliver impact, especially around some of those emerging issue areas that NATO is prioritizing and that we've discussed today? It would be quite useful to see some concrete commitments coming out of the summit in that regard. And then I just want to put a small hand raise about how the upcoming elections in 2024, a number of which will be quite consequential, could impact engagement with multilateral institutions, including NATO.
Yeah, and I'll just note for our listeners that we're talking about more than just the US elections next year. There's quite a few interesting elections coming up next year, so stay tuned. And Alex, what about you? What signposts are you watching?
I think obviously the big conversation will be centered on Ukraine and cooperation between NATO and Ukraine and how it's going to be structured exactly. If NATO doesn't offer what will be considered enough by Ukraine, this will probably somewhat sour political relationship, which is obviously not in the interest of either Ukraine or NATO. Also, another element to watch will be announcements around the deployments along the eastern flank, all the way from Finland to Romania, and joint activity under NATO umbrella along the eastern flank. And this includes everything from kinetic military to cyber and cyber defenses and work in the dis and misinformation arena.
Thank you both again, Lindsay and Alex, for joining us on the podcast today. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Please join us next week when we will continue our dive into the forces at work in 2023.
Thank you for listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast. Connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.